At a time when financial crime affects not only businesses but lives, it's crucial to have tools that simplify complexity. Chainalysis provides the technology and services that help governments, financial institutions, and crypto companies trace the movement of digital assets and uncover illicit activity. Whether it's helping to ensure compliance or tracking down those who abuse the system, Chainalysis is trusted by leaders in the fight against crypto related crime. As we confront the human toll behind these crimes, it's clear that the work to ensure transparency and justice in digital finance has never been more urgent. To learn more, visit chainalysis.com.
The U.S. Department of Defense is a market participant of unrivaled scale, sourcing critical supplies from a defense industrial base, or DIB, that spans the globe. But geopolitical competition with China is forcing DoD to rethink the vulnerabilities in that supply chain that supports the world's most powerful military, ours. Today, we will hear two perspectives on how DoD is thinking about critical dynamics in economic security, from novel ways to incentivize secure investment in the DIB to constraining the inflow of adversarial capital into the defense sector. Speaking with Wes Spurlock and David Rader, we explore how the Defense Department is working to improve the resilience and security of America's military supply chains, and why the DoD has a major due diligence and KYC challenge. We discuss the need to attract and scale private capital, move from spending to investing, identify future strategic investment, work with allies and partners, and stop the risk of technology transfer supporting China's military. David Rader is a senior advisor in the Office of the Secretary of Defense, where he serves across the Defense Innovation Unit, the Office of Strategic Capital, and the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, or DARPA. Previously, he was Deputy Director of Global Investment and Economic Security at DoD, where he focused on foreign direct investment, trade and industrial policy, and matters under the purview of the Committee on Foreign Investment in the U.S., known as CFIUS. Before serving in government, he held positions at Ernst & Young, J.P. Morgan, and RAND Corporation. And he also served as an infantryman in the U.S. Army. David is also an adjunct fellow at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. Wes Spurlock is co-founder and former senior advisor at the Office of Strategic Capital at DoD and former chief risk officer at AFWorks, the innovation arm of the Department of Air Force, where he was responsible for all due diligence and KYC processes across AFWorks' billion-dollar investment portfolio. Prior to his retirement earlier this year, Wes has held other key roles at DoD, including serving as a military aide to President Obama and President Trump, responsible for the Presidential Emergency Satchel, or nuclear football. He also served as a White House military operations officer. In 2020, Wes served as a White House Fellow at the U.S. International Development Finance Corporation. Take a listen to our latest conversation on Coercive Capital on the Illicit Edge Network. So today we'll be discussing the evolving role of the Department of Defense and economic security from two primary angles. One is strategic investment in the defense industrial base, and the other is protecting that base from adversarial capital. David, I want to start with you. Can you set the stage over the past several years and how DoD has broadened its lens on this convergence of economic and national security? What's driving that convergence from the DoD perspective?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I mean, historically, the DoD, probably until middle of the GWAT, Global War on Terrorism, was focused strictly on counter-threat finance, money laundering, terrorism-related things that mostly came from the special operations community. And that's a very narrow but meaningful mission. And so the liaisons there were supported by Treasury and the Department of Justice and the FBI. About 10 years ago, CFIUS, the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States, under FIRMA, now the most recent legislation, really started taking shape and kind of grabbing the leadership's eyes in the department. And so what used to be Office of Foreign Investment Review, which had about 8 people, quickly staffed up to about 80 or 90. And so they had that core mission of CFIUS, which is about investment screening and trying to detect and mitigate the risk arising from adversarial capital into the defense industrial base. But it started expanding beyond that, where we started thinking about the relationship between capital and national security. And so the military services, Army, Navy, Air Force, Marine Corps, Space Force, etc., the Fourth Estate, Missile Defense Agency, Space Development Agency, all those kind of apparatus came together under then the Office of Secretary of Defense to really start piecing together the whole picture of where capital and trade flows are occurring within the world and how the Department of Defense should think about them and try to respond. This isn't a core mission of the department in that sense. It's really about man, train, and equip a warfighting force, deterring an aggressor. And if worst case scenario, a war is to occur, we win and prevail in the combat. But started thinking about all those other things: cyber, space, energy, and economics, and information, and really about how the department should purpose resources and try to solve that problem as a complementary function to the other core warfighting domains: air, land, sea, and space. So legislation that was meant for something like a Treasury or a State Department like CFIUS really kind of opened the aperture. And then as we started investing more money, and Wes will talk about that here very soon, through Small Business Innovation Research and the Office of Strategic Capital, we really started thinking, hey, we cannot let our dollars and cents be going to our adversaries. And not only that, we need to make sure we're protecting the defense industrial base and the innovation ecosystem by keeping adversarial capital away and imposing technology controls and protections. And so you really start seeing this cadre of professionals come in. So instead of the core military just officer, this isn't pejorative, but we started getting bankers and lawyers and technologists and people who really understood this. And that's gone from, again, a very small, tucked away office within an undersecretariat to really one of the mainstays within the department. And every service secretary and every senior executive leader and undersecretary and the secretary are talking about it. And they're talking about it through the lens of the interagency. They're talking about it through the lens of international. And most importantly, talking about it through the lens of commercial partnership. So public-private partnership. Because at the end of the day, the private sector, of course, is the one really moving the money around the world. And the department as a market participant who needs to be thoughtful of its place and its authorities to help shape that landscape. So again, it's gone from, small backwater of a few folks trying to solve a very narrow problem to a real staple of what the department is meant to solve now on behalf of America.
And help us understand a little bit more about what's behind that. I mean, how much of this focus on investment in the defense industrial base and protecting against adversarial capital is really an outgrowth of the strategic competition with China? Tell us what kind of how you see that connectivity.
Yeah, so there's some interesting work that's been done on this, but I'll quickly say, if you were to Google search the F-35 versus the J-20 out of China, you would look at these two pictures and think, gosh, these things look a lot alike. And you can do that with almost all primary military systems. Not all, but a lot of them. You'd look and see, wow. So the U.S. has been developing this for 40 years. The Chinese in 4 years created something that looks the exact same or really narrow, really close to it. And so we started thinking, a lot of technology must be going out the door. And we started realizing, sure, that's a piece of it, but what you're getting is a lot of foreign adversarial investment into companies. The investors are really controlling the companies and saying, hey, we want you to manufacture this in China, or we want you to send this to our colleagues in China who are going to do test and evaluation and simulation of the blueprints. And we started realizing through the boardroom is where the Chinese were starting to get a lot of their technology by pushing on companies. And the companies, because of the Department of Defense's own shortcomings in adequately funding companies, the so-called valley of death, which is a term I don't love, but it's the term we use to describe the gap between innovation and research dollars all the way up until procurement and program or record dollars where you get recurring revenue, and it's a really healthy thing. All those little fissures in between where companies can fall and say, hey, we're not funded for 9 months, we need capital. And they look around in the private sector, specifically venture capital in the US says, we see you have a pathway forward, but it's too far out for us to invest in. We can't take that risk. And so the Chinese come calling. And the Chinese would say, great, we'll give you money to keep this company going. But in order to do that, we need to really look in the books. We want to look at the company. We want you to manufacture in the US and a whole bunch of different methods to start stealing our technology. So we'd spend all this money and labor to really build exquisite systems, radar, GPS, guided missiles. And then at the last, kind of minute here or later stage, the Chinese would come in through the boardroom and through investors. And so that's where we really started seeing it. The tipping and queuing we originally thought was about intellectual property or technology transfer, but it really became about capital and the level of control and assertion that a meaningful investor in the right place or the right board seats can impose upon a company to have them change their actions. The term is called FOCI, Foreign Ownership, Control, and Influence. And that's a very specific thing within Defense Counterintelligence Security Agency, DCSA. But writ large, it describes a framework of the ability to have somebody influence your company. And the last thing I'll say to that specifically is we originally thought, well, it's got to be, the board seat or the chief technology officer who comes in and says, Elaine, I want you to send your product to China or I'm going to pull your funding. And what we realized is it's more complex than that. There's a whole bunch of unique debt instruments that can be involved in this. There's a bunch of joint ventures, technology sharing agreements, royalties, and even consumers or customer bases. There was a company that came to us who said, we have no Chinese investment. We said, well, that's good. And they said, well, we have one client who's 100% a Chinese, or one client who's 100% of our revenue is a Chinese company. And I said, well, are you beholden to them? They said, well, of course. They said, if they, pull up tomorrow and don't want to do business with us, we're out of business. So we have to do what they want. And I said, well, what do they want from you? They said, well, they want us to move to China for production. I thought, well, okay. So we're starting to understand the site picture instead of the, oh, it's a spy with a thumb drive sneaking it out under his shoe on a flight to Beijing. It's normal traditional business behavior that's really shaping this landscape. And so that's when as we started seeing these anecdotes and these stories, we started looking at the methodology and the processes and what we need to do to thwart that.
Yeah, it's actually fascinating because what you've described feels to me like a DoD's version of KYC, right? But on steroids to address a lot of potential risks and gaps. And how is this process of sort of building this infrastructure to protect the investment, to ensure that the defense industrial base is not, exposed in ways that we don't want? How is that reframing the relationship with private sector partners?
Yeah, I mean, well, luckily Wes is here to talk about the Office of Strategic Capital and his incredible work in building that with some really sharp colleagues. I mean, it used to be this is not the government's job. This is a private sector problem. Gosh, we've got trillions of dollars in the capital markets. If you want to go draw from the well, you go call J.P. Morgan and they'll give you a loan. And we realize that's not an efficient model, and even in a truly capitalist system, it's actually not. It's maybe too harsh for the market realities. So we started thinking we need to give matching dollars. We need to give loans and loan guarantees. We need to be better partners. We need to share meaningful information. There's plenty of investors out there who want to invest in American companies, who want to invest in American tech. But if you go to DoD and you say, well, how many widgets are you going to buy next year? We say, oh, we can't tell you. And they say, well, I can't model out then my return on revenue. And for that reason, I'm going to pull back my capital. And then we go, well, gosh, you need to invest in these companies. And they go, well, how much is the deal? How much is in it for me? We go, well, we can't tell you. So we started reframing this through, we need to share information. We need to share our market maps and our roadmaps and our pathways. We need to offer financial tools and incentives. And we need to actually be thinking about this as a business standpoint, not just a government standpoint. It used to be private sector creates, government buys, and government expends. And we started to realize, no, we have a much more hands-on role in this. And again, Wes, we'll talk about shortly about, what we went through with the Office of Strategic Capital framing this. But, on the far right and the far left of the political spectrum, we encountered far right, conservatives saying, hey, this is government intervention into the marketplace, and far left liberals saying, hey, this is corporate welfare. But what we got was in the center, and why Office of Strategic Capital and Defense Innovation Unit and all these other things have really started to see the light of day, is because we realized we do need more of a market presence, and we need it in the market business mindset to help address these issues. We can no longer just sit back and be a customer who walks into the store and says, we'll buy a rocket, we'll buy a spaceship, we'll buy a laser. If we do that, we will get, we just won't get it in time. We won't get the right stuff, and the market will not keep innovating and creating. The real engine of America is small business, the innovators, the ingenuity. And so the DoD is now harnessing that and playing a meaningful role in that, or at least trying to.
Absolutely. Wes, let's dig into the Office of Strategic Capital. You're a co-founder of that office and former senior advisor to OSC, which was stood up in December of 2022 to scale private capital towards national security. I'd love to hear a little bit more about how OSC was formed, what some of the early thinking was, and where it is now and where you think it's going as part of this infrastructure within DoD to secure the defense industrial base.
Yeah, thank you, Lane. And I want to add one bit to there. It was founded to attract and scale private capital for national security, and I think that's important because, to a lot of David's point earlier, a lot of what we have been doing to combat adversarial capital in the DoD has really revolved around stick-based approaches to the working with the private sector, and where OSC and AFWorks and DIU and a lot of the folks that have been trying to build new ways to incentivize private capital is to attract that capital and then to scale it. The stand-up of that really started in the throes of COVID, when we were working with. I was at the Development Finance Corporation working with the Defense Production Act, and we were trying to execute loans to help respond to the COVID pandemic, especially on leveraging debt-based tools in the interagency to work on PPE, diagnostics, all the things that we were trying to figure out in the days like of 2020, 2021. And when we looked at that lens, we realized that we were not using a tool that literally all but 3 departments in the federal government were using, and that being loans and loan guarantees, which are completely separate from the acquisition process that we use in the DoD, but very complementary and oftentimes a better tool for the job than we were using at the time. We realized there was 131 federal credit programs in 2024 before we came on to be, and none in the Department of Defense, Labor, or Justice, and just didn't understand why. And as we did some digging, we realized that there was a lot of opportunities for us to use grants and contracts, and still to this day, DIU is doing phenomenal work. Following my time at the Development Finance Corporation, I became the chief risk officer at AFWorks, and they were doing a lot of early stage contracts, grants-based small business innovation research funds to really seed technologies in the research to prototype phase of their growth. But myself, Dr. Jason Rathje, and J.R. Gibbons were sitting there wondering what happens when they get to prototype, because we can only use grants and contracts so well, and we can only incentivize private capital with by actually partnering with them to get to the level we needed to. When we looked at the valley of death David talked about, from prototype to product and then product to scale, we saw that those types of tools were not always the SBIR tools were not really the best way to get there. And we found that if we use tools like the federal credit programs that are being used by the SBA and the Export-Import Bank and the Department of Energy, and had been used since before there was a Department of Defense, but just not in the Department of Defense, we may be able to bring better tools to the conversation. And we likened it to, like, we were hitting nails with screwdrivers because we didn't have hammers in our toolbox. And so for coming out of AFWorks, me and David saw there was a report that came out in a Wall Street Journal article that wrote that China was benefiting more from the Small Business Innovation Research Fund program than the U.S. was. And that kind of that stuck in our craw a little bit, and we worked to get the reauthorization of the Small Business Innovation Research Program, the SBIR program, through working with Congress and to kind of not to defend against that claim, but to build a way to make it better. And so we built out. Most of the government calls it due diligence, but you're correct in the parlance of the KYC for the DoD, and we built that program out to make sure that we were that no one could really say that China was benefiting more from that program anymore. But after we got to that stage, we realized that we could give as much money as we wanted, but when they get to the end of that, the usefulness of the SBIR program, for instance, then what? They have 2 options. They find private capital, they get to be a program of record, or they go and they take adversarial capital that is not in our interest, or they go bankrupt. I guess there's 4 options. And our real goal there was to provide them alternatives to that. And so by standing up the Office of Strategic Capital, we opened up new tools, and we tapped into other departments and agencies that were already doing that. A lot of the big movements in the stand-up of the office revolved around the partnership the office has with the Small Business Administration, and specifically the Small Business Investment Company, SBIC program, which is a debt-levered fund model that's been around since 1958 and allows us to partner with private capital allocators and allows us to use the debt alongside their equity investments to incentivize them to invest in the technologies that the DoD needs. And so while David, we've talked a lot about the procurement of a lot of how the DoD buys the things we buy. When we talked about the economic instrument of power from the Department of Defense, that's meant we buy things. And up until now, because we've spent all of the money from the DoD, but we've never really invested. And I think that the nuance there is important, because with the tools and the programs that OSC is bringing to bear and the other departments and agencies have been using for years, we actually can see a return on investment. We can, my mom can understand that if I give a grant or I give a loan, if I can achieve the same objective with either of those tools, and I can get the taxpayers' money repaid back to them through the use of a loan, we should probably do that based off of the financial situations the country is in. And that's really what the brilliance of the utilizing these tools in the specific situations they're useful for, with the working with the incentivizing the private capital allocators that are incentivized to do quick returns, high ROI, SaaS-based investments. Well, that's great for the economy, and that's great for those their investors. But that's not great when 80% of the R&D in the U.S. now is coming from the private sector. And if we don't have access to those technologies, those microprocessors, those rare earth magnets, those things that are in the things we buy, then we don't have the best in class technologies for us to procure. So the utilization of really right now loans, loan guarantees, and debt-based tools that are they're regulated under the Federal Credit Reform Act, not the Federal Acquisition Regulation, is a very different kind of structure, a very different framework, and very different guardrails. But when those tools are used for the specific jobs that they can be best used for, it can be a multiplier effect to the other tools that the Department of Defense is already using.
And how do you determine within this OSC framework what areas of investment should be prioritized?
So the Office of Strategic Capital first starts with the 14 critical technology areas of the Department of Defense, and really breaks that down further into what the technologies that are the components inside the capabilities we work on. So really, where is the commercial markets going to be a large majority of that investment, and how can we partner with them to do that? And so really that's laid out. We have the Office of Strategic Capital released an investment strategy in I think March of 24, and that kind of lays out the first early research into where we think that marginal dollar coming from the Office of Strategic Capital can have the maximum impact to incentivize, to attract and scale private capital for national security.
Mhm. And how would you describe the response from the marketplace around the approach? How has private capital kind of come into this space? Have they been supportive? And what else might need to be done to get uh, private capital sort of off the sidelines in some cases and into some of these more strategic investments?
So I think it's like you said, we were stood up in 2022. We were authorized in December of 23 for the 24 NDAA, and the Office of Chief Capital was appropriated in March or April of 24. So we're now 6 months into that. In that, we will see they just released a notice of funding opportunity in September, and so expect to start to receive inbounds, and they're working through that process now. Again, I've since left the Office of Strategic Capital and retired from the DoD, but expecting those organic programs to be we're receiving a lot. There is a lot of inbound on that, specifically for those programs. What I would point to in that is the partnership with the SBA was really something that the DoD was able to leverage the authorities and the appropriations of the Small Business Administration through the SBIC program. And that allowed them to really kind of see where is the pulse of people that would be investing in those critical technologies for the DoD, but for the ROI didn't meet what they needed to do to meet their fiduciary responsibility. And so what I would point to the numbers on that is that from that program that's been around since 1958, and since that partnership and those programs have come on, the inbounds, the interest in licensed funds through that program has increased 400%. And the efficiency, the timeline for that program has increased 400% based off the partnership there and also the kind of desire to work towards that. So that's a huge turnaround for a program that is like one of the most efficient and effective programs in the entire federal government. And how that even with a program that's already up and running and doing very well, the ability to really make the program put gas on the fire, if you will, has shows that there is a lot of interest, and I think there's more gaining there. You talk about the constituencies; it's not really just the private capital constituencies that we've had to focus on. We've had to focus on figuring out how to convince the DoD that it is worth that investment is a thing and it's not just buying things. When you say investment in the DoD, 4 years ago, that just meant you buy the things. Now it's starting to people are starting to understand how you can leverage different tools to achieve objectives more efficiently. So you have the constituencies within the DoD also matter. We have to convince them to figure out how those partnerships matter at the services, at the DoD, and also Congress. It was very critical that we got Congress on board to make sure that they understood why we were doing what we were doing, how this was not a new thing. We've talked a lot about innovation in the DoD, and I think that for me, innovation is kind of doing something new with the tools you already have. For us, this is doing something new, but it's not new because, like I said, there's been federal credit programs since before the DoD was even a thing, and it's just that we've never had the authorities to do it organically for the Department of Defense, and now we do, and we're excited to kind of see that grow. I think we're watching more and more excitement as people start to see how they can apply those tools to their problem set. And more and more, they're seeing how much more efficient it is by using these types of programs because it's much more efficient for every appropriated dollar to make sure that we're giving the taxpayers their return on investment while also leveraging our competitive advantage. I think, frankly, when we think about the great power competition that we're facing, we have a communist country using a capitalist system better than we are, and that is problematic. This is our comparative advantage. We have private capital allocators that are second to none anywhere in the world, inside our borders, working that care about this country and care about the future of this country. And so our ability to tap into them, but also understand their demands and understand what they need out of the how financial markets work. That is something that's new to us. We've heard them. We've been working with them over the last few years. And then we're excited that we finally have tools that can understand and meet them where they are and also tap into their comparative advantage in this competition.
So, one of the shortcomings of OSC, and it's not a flaw of OSC's by design, is it is still super technology focused. And there's a whole bunch of different things within this investment ecosystem that need to be de-risked or underwritten or at least supported by DoD that we care about. And Elaine, you and I have written about, ports and cranes and all of these other things that DoD wants resolved. The U.S. Navy needs to be able to land at ports all around the world. And we don't have a real tool for that. There's the Development Finance Corporation, and Wes knows way more about than I do, but they're not the perfect tool to solve this problem. And so one of the things we are seeing from, or one of the critiques we are seeing from industry is OSC is a great first step. It's done a great job. There's more required though. And so equity investments or things outside of technology that are boring, like manufacturing. And I don't mean that again pejoratively towards manufacturers, but compared to, space lasers, I think that's probably a little more exciting. But domestic manufacturing, critical and rare earths, processing, extraction, et cetera, ports and infrastructure. Those are really important things that OSC could either be expanded to include, or a different program could really focus on, that the investment community has made very clear to us they want to be part of, but yet we still are not there. So we're hoping that Congress will either authorize or appropriate or repurpose or reconfigure some part of the government to go after those other things that really do matter that we seem to be falling short in a little bit.
At a time when financial crime affects not only businesses but lives, it's crucial to have tools that simplify complexity. Chainalysis provides the technology and services that help governments, financial institutions, and crypto companies trace the movement of digital assets and uncover illicit activity. Whether it's helping to ensure compliance or tracking down those who abuse the system, Chainalysis is trusted by leaders in the fight against crypto related crime. As we confront the human toll behind these crimes, it's clear that the work to ensure transparency and justice in digital finance has never been more urgent. To learn more, visit chainalysis.com.
Now, to this concept of adversarial capital, which, David, I think you introduced very briefly a bit earlier, but can you describe for our listeners the concept of adversarial capital and how DoD and more broadly government investments might be at risk?
Yeah, I mean, and it's hard for me because I have some really fun and exciting anecdotes. I always like telling. Somewhere between classified and government protected, it prohibits me from sharing them. But and Wes and I rode left seat, right seat on these for many years, so he's laughing because he knows exactly where I'm going with this. But what we started seeing is again, I'll pick on China because they're the primary perpetrator of this. But you do get a little bit with Russia, and even then you get allies and partners who wittingly and unwittingly invest in companies and they think, gosh, this is some really cool tech. We really need this. And it makes their way back to them. And then sometimes it's not well controlled. But we started to see Chinese state-owned enterprises spreading money across the country and across the world, and there's somewhere between Belt and Road and then just made in China 2025. And then just general military civ fusion coming out of Beijing. And we started looking at this and realizing that you do have just general investments. They want to get their money out. They want to, enrich themselves. That's fine. But we started seeing this very targeted investments into things that build into critical supply chains, like you said, or strategic components. Let's back up on this. The airplane. There were a bunch of single investments into airplane companies that when you look at them in a small piece, they don't matter. They try to buy a US company that makes landing gears for airplanes. Is that a critical national security threat? Are we going to lose the Great War because of landing gears? The answer is no. However, if you start looking at an aggregate, they ended up basically everything they couldn't steal through industrial espionage or actual legitimate traditional espionage. They started buying US companies in this value chain. And all of a sudden we realized, oh, shoot, they're going to build basically a competitor to the Boeing 747 or the Airbus A320 or A319neo. And they did. And they made the Comac C919, the 919. And that is a direct competitor to Boeing and Airbus. So at an economic level, you think, gosh, they're trying to erode our market share. They're trying to, cut down on we feel that we have a reduction in tax revenue and foreign sales. That's a reduction in the labor force. This is a degradation of the U.S. economic might. But more so, China gets to introduce a competitor that can be used for heavy lift capabilities or for cargo or for delivery, both for its own, regional as well as global dominance if they need to, or their pursuit of that, as well as then military capabilities for heavy lift, airplanes. And Wes flew heavy lift airplanes, so I won't, I don't want to steal his thunder here. But so we started realizing, okay, they're going at this. And so we started pulling these apart and going to the companies and saying, why did you sell your product to China? Or why did you move your supply chain? They said, well, they originally came in and they bought 15% of our company at an above market rate. And me as a CEO, this is a great deal. I wanted access to the Chinese markets and I wanted a premium on my company. It increases the value of my company. And I said, okay, that's a very fair business decision. And then what happened? Well, then they increased their position to 30%, which again, the partnership was going great. And then what happened? Oh, well, then they started stealing our blueprints. And okay, well, that's normally not what competitor or investors do. They would want to invest in the company to help you grow the company, right? And then they started selling our blueprint or giving our blueprints to a factory literally across the street that manufacture the exact same components. And then they started selling or stealing products from us, or they would influence the company, or they would have the CTO send it over. So a board member would write the CTO and ask for an engineer to send a new demo of a product over to this factory for us. And we couldn't understand why, but gosh, they own 30% of our company, so we didn't really want to make too big of a stink about it. And then we realized they were reverse engineering the final piece of this. They made our widget and they sold it on the market for 15% of the cost that we make it. And within 18 months, we were filing for bankruptcy. They then went and bought the remaining assets out of bankruptcy. And because there's no protections over bankruptcy, there is under a nuanced part of CFIUS FIRMA regs. But I mean, fundamentally, they were a parasite to us. They drained us of our value and they killed us. And so you start looking at this across the board, you think, oh, this is what adversarial capital is. It's what comes in as an investment, as a capital infusion or a capital partner, strategic partner, but really is meant just to finance you enough to steal and then hopefully capture the value on the back end for them, either strategically or economically to carve you out of the market. And you can look at what Huawei's done with Nokia and Ericsson. I mean, Huawei is a completely vertically integrated communication system from towers down to handsets. And originally it came from them stealing modems and replicating them and selling for pennies on a dollar. And now you talk to Nokia and they say, we can't even sell to African or South American markets because we can only sell a small piece of the value chain, and China can deliver or Huawei specifically, can deliver the entire value chain integrated for much cheaper than we can, even a component of it. And for that reason, we're losing market share, we're losing revenue, and that's money out of R&D, that's money out research and development for our company, that's money out of tax revenue, that's less employees in my country, etc. So that's kind of like the model for adversarial capital. And so again, we started seeing this where we thought, okay, you can't just say investment from China is bad. But if you look at these anecdotes and you look at towards a strategic picture, like China wants a heavy lift aircraft that the U.S. that they can indigenously produce, so that if the Great War breaks out and we say we're not selling you Boeing airplanes anymore, they say no problem, we have our own. Well, we have our own COMAC version. And you think, shoot, that was a choke point we had on them, and they have inverted that with us again around critical minerals. You saw they banned the sale of antimony to the United States. Antimony goes into a lot of things, including almost all of our munitions. This is really important. And so we're trying to think about ways we can, pursue our positive capital markets of the free flow of capital and trade and all the good things that have come from that, especially from U.S. dominance since the 1950s. And how do we not completely just collapse that system under the fear and frustration what China's done, while also trying to constrain China? We cannot contain them. You cannot contain the flow of capital. And so we assess that the best thing to do is try to constrain Chinese economic activity and really, really carve out, mitigate, or block adversarial capital rather than what is sometimes called dumb capital, which is just, 5% investment, no board seats, no control. We just want our money back over time, kind of like how your 401k or your Roth IRA is structured, which is where we've come to terms with is pretty acceptable. But rather than targeted and specific investments that either meant to really pull apart a company, extract a technology, or help China get leverage and a competitive advantage into a market vertical that is state directed or state incentivized activity. So that's how we frame adversarial capital. And I'll wrap it up here just to say, you can imagine when you look at something as complex and unique as the defense industrial base, which goes all the way from stealth fighters down to Band-Aids and, running shoes for soldiers, everything is kind of on the table. Now, not all of it matters the same, but once you start looking at the stories and how the Chinese have done this specifically, you start realizing that they're kind of going after everything. And so that's what we're trying to build tools to protect that without really just saying, hey, we're going to make the state-owned, economy of the United States, which we could and should not ever do.
Well, I was going to add to that because I think one of the things that we found through the working on the KYC, we'll call it KYC for this program at the SBIR, is that when we talk about investment, we talk about our private capital markets, and we talk about trying to tap into that and leverage that from the Department of Defense or through really as the government. We try to drive objective measures of subjective things and then we set out the playbook. So we say, okay, 10% foreign ownership is the maximum we'll allow. And there's no real reason why 11% or 9% are good or bad, but that bifurcation there gives the playbook away. So like the idea and what is 10%? If 10% and no board seat is not as impactful as just having a board seat and being able to access the IP and tap into that. But also we are not, the folks that are making the policy decisions are not incentivized to take that risk, because investment is about risk and reward. And so you take more risk, the possibility of more reward is, you're into your bonus or whatever, but that's not what happens when we're looking at from a government investment perspective. And so looking at it through the lens of our private capital allocators and the folks that know that and live that day to day, but also being able to inform and enlighten the early stage tech companies are very great at exquisite technology. They don't understand why they shouldn't take an outsized return from an investor, because it seems like the right thing to do. That's the business 101. But when we can show them, time and time again, how we've seen this technique be used to take down a company just like theirs, or them lose all their IP, them lose all their life savings, and no matter how great the technology is, they no longer have the ability to influence it, and we don't have the ability to access it as the DoD. That is extremely problematic. So over the last few years, the ability to tap in and work with private capital allocators, but also be able to build these systems that allow for subjective measure, subjective realization, and also integration across the federal government, across the really the private capital markets as well, to understand what people are seeing and find trends and try to address those, so we know when if we see multiple data points that tell us we're going after this technology sector, then we can work to defend that or to help those companies that are being attacked in that. I think that has been something we've seen it across the federal government, but there's been an awakening. And if you look at the cyber reauthorization bill in 2023, we were able to kind of frame that into three main lines of effort that are, very general, but one being obviously the foreign ownership, but not like the foreign ownership control and influence part of that. Like what does that actually mean? But also protected against cybersecurity, as well as the information protection that go into that. What would a KYC program look like across from the government? But really, we wanted to make sure we wrote it this way to couch that all under an umbrella of education, making sure that we're letting people see the data points and see the vignettes that are similar to their problem set, where other companies tried this and it didn't work, and why it didn't work, because I think those are more powerful, where people can learn from those examples on their own. And that limits the amount of technologies, companies, people that we have to interact with. Then they're making that decision for a financial decision. They're knowing what the risk is, and then then it's a free market. They're going to make that decision, and they have to deal with that accordingly. But we find time and time again that just the ability to educate the technology companies, specifically for the DoD, has been a game changer and changed behavior, so that it kind of takes care of itself. Just making sure that we shed light on what the problems that they might be facing if they go down that road.
Yeah. And do we have enough visibility across the critical supply chains within this space to be able to make a proper assessment? And how deep do we need to go? And where's that line between what the government should understand in terms of that risk versus some of the private sector capital providers or tech providers and their role? I mean, do we need a different kind of conversation around that? Do we need more cooperation?
I mean, fundamentally, yes. You asked a lot of questions, so I'll just answer a simple yes. But if you go to the average person and you say, again, go to my mom, smart lady, I say, hey, does cobalt or lithium, is that a national security issue? She's going to say no. And I say, okay, is lithium extraction, refining, and processing into batteries a national security issue? She's going to say, DOD should not be doing that. And I say, okay. It goes into batteries. Batteries go into Reaper drones, Predator drones, all sorts of our space assets and our military vehicles, our undersea stuff. And she goes, oh, yeah, well, that's national security. So you have to walk through that chain. So if you go to the average person and say, does a cobalt mine in Congo, is that a national security concern? They say no. But if you say, but if that gets choked off from us, like we talked about the antimony, from us being able to field, platforms for national security, they'd say yes. And so that's what we're kind of going through. And we have to find a way to quantify it. So I'm giving a story here, but really once you start doing the math on it and you start seeing the challenges that would occur to multi-year procurement, sustainment of defense platforms, you realize instantly these are huge issues that we are not investing in properly. And so we have good clarity in a lot of the supply chain soft points, but we do not have entirety and proper clarity. And then what should the investors be aware of, and the companies themselves? So I'll give an anecdote, actually, that's open. So A123 was a battery company spun out of MIT Lincoln Labs, high-density lithium-ion battery cells. They had multiple rounds from U.S. Department of Energy and then private capital. Ultimately, the Chinese came in and offered an extreme market premium. It backed away all the U.S. investors. They thought, there's no way we're going to jump in on this. It's too expensive for us, but good for A123. The A123 was cash short. They were in the red. The Chinese kept pushing them. Yeah, the investment's coming. And then right before the bankruptcy cliff, A123 backed away and said, we're not going to invest. A123 went into bankruptcy. The foreign buyers bought all the assets, all the IP out of bankruptcy. And this is before CFIUS was really a thing, or at least was in its infancy. They moved all that battery power to China. That battery power later, technology capability, et cetera, the structure of the cells is exactly what fed into the entire build out of CATL, cattle batteries, which is fueling the entire EV marketplace in China. So you're looking at this thinking, gosh, and now you're seeing, Ford is partnering, the Ford Lightning truck is like partnered with CATL in Michigan. So you're thinking a U.S. technology built out of MIT Lincoln Labs, sponsored and paid for by taxpayers through the Department of Energy, basically got strangled by adversarial capital, sent to China, and is now crushing our energy marketplace as an outsized, proportionate control of the EV value chain. And because of that, they're also absorbing so much cobalt and lithium and all these things and nickel and copper that go into batteries. That they have almost, hegemonic control over a lot of those value chains and a lot of those offtake agreements, to where we actually can't even penetrate it. And you're thinking, if you went to somebody and said this MIT Lincoln Lab company going into bankruptcy is going to be why China is producing electric vehicles at a scale in which is abnormally unhealthy and synthetic, and unhealthy for the marketplace, nobody could frame that in that right context until you go through that story. And then you say, is this a national security risk? And everybody goes, yes, absolutely. So you have to tell investors this story. You have to tell entrepreneurs the story. You have to tell policymakers and lawmakers the story. And then you have to come up with a solution to this problem. And again, if I go to my mom and I say, but mom, I want the DOD to buy a cobalt mine in Congo, she goes, no, that's not your job. But I don't know where to break apart that problem set to show where we need to invest in. So that's a long answer to say, we do know a lot of choke points. We know a lot of places to go after this. We know a lot of things to do, but we're not there yet with our own comfort to solve these problems. And hopefully it's on the way.
Yeah, yeah. Thanks, David. It's a great example. We've got a report coming out in the next couple of months, looking specifically at lithium and the EV battery supply chain, uh, and it's exactly to your point. We need to be able to quantify where there's a potential for a geopolitical disruption, and break apart these critical supply chains to understand where the real choke points are. But in the EV battery space, it's fascinating because it's really a vertically integrated supply chain from the mine to final assembly of an EV. And, we may get to a point where it's just difficult to compete, more generally. I mean, we're already feeling that to some extent with cheap exports of Chinese EVs. But if we really look at the subcomponent level, the midstream battery production. I mean, that's where a lot of the risk is, and it is tech driven. And your example of A123 is spot on. And that story goes back even earlier to technology that was developed at the University of Texas at Austin on lithium ion batteries. This goes back to the early 2000s. And so, we're really good at creating innovative solutions. We're not so good in the US at scaling, right? And that's something that we're going to have to figure out how to do more effectively across some of these critical supply chains if we want to keep that risk, out of an adversarial capital out of the US and out of our industrial base. So it's really interesting to see how all of this is going to converge. And DoD, I think, has an outsized role in terms of helping us understand these economic security risks and applying some of these tools to be able to reduce that risk. I want to pivot to a question that you both may be interested in answering, but it has to do with how some of these challenges connect to our alliances with countries like Mexico, some of our European allies, maybe even some of the fence sitters out there. Brazil comes to mind, where we do have the potential to create new opportunities for supply chains and trade engagement. But we also, need to be thinking carefully about how we do that. Do you think that there's a common understanding, particularly with our core allies, around the concern of adversarial capital? We can address that on our own, but we might be better off to do that with a more common approach. So, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I'll start. What Wes is going to have very many meaningful comments to follow this. I mean, the short answer is yes. I mean, I think all of our allies and partners are starting to see this through the same lens. The joy of globalization, one of the upsides of it, there's many downsides we're feeling the strain of too, is that the supply chains, production chains, all these things are diversified around the world. And so we cannot be silly to say, well, we're just going to do all of America. And, like that's just not even an option, maybe for a very narrow thing. But even if you look at the pinch felt by the drone industry, the small group one, group two drone industry in the United States, they alone are saying, no, this has to be spread across multiple countries. So by the time you get to complex ecosystems like vehicles, it's going to be through somewhere between 5 and 50 countries per vehicle. So we absolutely need allies and partners in this. We need to find a right way to incentivize this. The Australians and the Japanese are with us all the way on this critical minerals, rare earths, however you want to categorize it, approach. We have made huge leaps and bounds with them both through the first Trump administration, through the Biden administration, I'm sure through the second Trump administration. But there are still many soft spots in the marketplace where we are not adequately engaging or incentivizing, and the private sector wants to jump in, but the U.S. government is not sending adequate signals. We are not having ambassadors and foreign service officers, as well as business leaders, meaningfully corral this in. And it kind of goes back to my earlier comment about government intervention versus corporate welfare. Once we realize that we need to stop assessing capitalism through the lens of like, well, the private sector will solve this and the government needs to play a meaningful role, we'll be much more effective in this, because the Chinese are, to Wes's point, communist country using capitalism very effectively. We need to take a little more credence with our interest in structuring and incentivizing and rewarding good capital behavior to really incentivize global supply chains. And then that hopefully will build more cohesion and unity with allies and partners. The one thing, of course, is the world changes constantly. I mean, we were fighting the Japanese, at 70 years ago, 80 years ago, and now they're, maybe our best ally in the world. And I only say that to say we cannot also just index on allies based off today. We can't say, well, the U.S. and country X have a great relationship, so therefore we're just going to divvy up the supply chain. We have to think, no, this has to go through 4 or 5 countries, really, or at least we have to have it set up so we can have contingency plans in case things, defense center countries specifically, do realign in a different direction than we're comfortable with, or just the physics of economics change the market in a way that we have to be more responsive to, because we can't have a great financial crisis occur in whatever, we'll just say Mexico or Japan, and then we say, well, no, shoot, we're out of batteries again. We have to be thoughtful about how that world actually looks. So, but I do know that we have capital partners out there who are looking all over the world for investments, and the government is either not in front of them as much as we should, alongside them as much as we should, or behind them as much as we should. And so that's something for us to think about and fix. But I am with you that ultimately the best way for us to solve a lot of these problems is to remain extremely focused on near shoring, ally shoring, and friend shoring. But we do need to build in a bit of redundancy for pure domestic production. That doesn't mean it has to be an everyday thing. Sometimes we're above a market cost. The market clearing price is maybe too great here in the US, but we can also not be in that point where we say, oh, geez, we need to stand up this entire industry because, some cataclysmic financial or geopolitical event. And now we're going to look at Ohio and we're just going to start building a bunch of factories there and hope that they catch up to the market, because that will never occur. So Wes, I would be interested in your thoughts from your time all around the world too.
No, I think that's a lot. You hit a lot of the things. I think globalization has kind of turned into friends and alliesization. It's coming out of COVID. I think when people everywhere from microprocessors to toilet paper, most people in the country now and really around the world know what supply chains mean and how it can affect them and how it can really bring the world to a halt. I think that we've seen that we probably were behind the power curve, and we've seen, let's say, adversaries taking advantage of that and then have a head start. But we also have the competitive advantage if we focus what we need to focus on. I agree with the tapping into friends and allies and making sure that we continue to provide one, optionality, and two, aligned incentives. I think that's really the key to looking at the big picture there. And I would bring that even down from an international to a interagency model as well across the federal government. We have a lot of folks that are solving things in silos, and the ability to tap into those tools and make sure that we're as efficient as possible for the taxpayers, to make sure that we're using the right tool for the right job, because there is a lot of rice bowling in silos where people know that's my job, I'm going to take care of that, even though it's not really a priority and it's not really something that they're actually going to get to. They still want to claim fiefdom and prevent that from being effective. If people want to take things on and solve the problems. But if they don't, I think that we need to start to really be eyes wide open enough to say, hey, though we could do this, we're probably not the best person to do this, and we'd love your help. That is not incentivized through our kind of form of government, through our budget process and otherwise. And so I think ways to break that down to where we have people sitting around the table saying, hey, we got to solve these 5 problems. David, you're best suited to solve this. Elaine, you're best suited to solve that. Let's go do it. I don't care whose job it is. The sooner we get to that across the government, as soon as we incentivize both the organizations and the individuals to leverage that level of focus, we really will be able to make inroads. I think that's the kind of that's the next step, and I think we're progressing in that direction based off what we've seen over the last 4 years.
Yeah. Thanks for mentioning that broader question about how we organize ourselves in the US government to address some of these issues. David and I have written a couple of pieces on that topic, and it really is time for a stronger realignment and as you said, breaking down some of these silos to deal with these threats that really take us into a new space. And again, linking in this private sector engagement in a more meaningful way, because we really can't do this, just from a government lens. So, maybe one final question for both of you, and I guess it's a little bit of forecasting, but if you had one or two thoughts on what the new administration should be doing to take some of this work forward, to address some of the more critical challenges when we're talking about protecting ourselves from adversarial capital, but also really helping to push forward strategic investment where it's needed most. What are your thoughts on that? David, we'll start with you.
Yeah. I mean, I would argue that there should be, well, I'll give both carrots and sticks here. There should be greater sticks, bigger, more powerful sticks for those who really misbehave. You're seeing some of if you look at the headlines, you type in, export control violations of companies, they're egregious. I mean, it's like, I won't pick on companies, but I mean, you can look it up. There are companies that got asked to send over a blueprint of a helicopter, and they sent over also a blueprint of a tank and the rocket system and, an aircraft carrier. And you're thinking, what are you guys doing? There has to be something going on there where the company says, we know we're going to pay X amount of fine, and in exchange, we're going to get an even bigger reward from the Chinese for this. And same with CFIUS. I mean, we really need to be hammering companies saying, you made an agreement, you knew the law, you violated the law, and in exchange right now, we're going, you owe us $100,000 in fines. The company goes, no problem. What we need to do is say, you owe us, $1 billion in fines, and you guys are going to jail. Because there's a reason if the war breaks out, and again, hopefully not, but their planes are going to look like ours and be able to do what ours do, and we will not have military superiority. And it's because for 20 years we gave them our best stuff, either wittingly or unwittingly, and we need to penalize that behavior. It is unacceptable. On the carrot side, we do need to be rewarding companies, and we do need to be incentivizing investors to play into this. And so I'm sure President Trump and his staff, he's picked some great folks in there already. I mean, John Ratcliffe going to CIA thinks about this problem set. Marco Rubio, if he becomes the Secretary of State, and I'm just pulling off headlines that I see. I haven't seen the official announcement yet. He is wholly aware of the relationship between capital and national security. His Patriotic Investment Act is meant to do this. It's meant to penalize as well as reward. And so my thought is that the Trump administration would build a new office within the executive office of the president that is meant to solely coordinate on this issue and address economic security and economic statecraft. Because it's too big of a problem set and it spans too many things for the National Security Council to really bite onto, because there's just too many things that pop up. The war in Ukraine has drained a lot of resources. Is that as important as China? I don't know. Or Taiwan? I don't know. But I do know that all the resources are being redirected towards that. And so they're not able to focus on these long-term things. So I'm hopeful that the existing authorities are probably abundant enough across government. But to our point, there needs to be a consolidation and a really directional focus in this new administration. And I don't think there's enough for people just to do it on the side. This needs to be a core function and job. So seeing this within the executive office of the president, or in theory, a department meant to do this would be really useful and meaningful. And if I was king for a day, or if President Trump elect called me and asked me what to do, I would advise those two things.
No, I mean, I think that's right. I think that the hard part is not that we don't have the folks working on this right now. The hard part is we don't have someone that this is a top priority for them. To David's point, when you talk about investment, you talk about supply chains, you talk about private capital markets, and then you say the DoD, there's a percentage of folks that kind of turn off and say that's not your job. There's a fear of the DoD having more authorities and more power, and I don't really have a thought, agree or disagree on it, but I do know that national security their economic security is national security in a lot of ways, and more so in the environment we find ourselves in today. So understanding how the private capital markets interact with the technologies we work on, as well as like other facets of national security, especially internationally, like with the DoD, we don't buy the things inside the things we buy. Like we buy F-35s, we don't buy microprocessors in the F-35s. They just come with them. They're acquired in those supply chains. And so the incentive is for the folks to get them as cheap as possible. And oftentimes that's not in the best interest of the warfighter. And we're not setting them up with success with the best tools at their disposal to go fight and win wars for our country. That goes across the spectrum. One of the things that I do, to David's point, the Secretary of State is also the chairman of the Development Finance Corporation. And so it would be interesting to see if they are to leverage the authorities laid out in the BUILD Act that drive DFC towards a national security focus. But that's not to tap into the folks that were at OPIC that are focused on developmental and making them do national security type stuff. Those are not necessarily in their view of public service. So staff up and build a team that can focus on that and leverage the authorities, whether they're existing or to still be determined, to execute on this, to make sure that we have a mission that focuses on this in the federal government, that is eyes wide open, as well as has at its disposal all the tools in the toolbox. I don't think that we would want to send soldiers today to war with World War I rifles. We want them to have the best technology. That's the same thing. We don't send people to do our nation's bidding, whether that's national security or diplomacy. We don't send them to do those without the best tools and the tools they need for the job. But we are doing that with respect to the economic kind of instrument of power, that is statecraft, whatever you want to call it, because we just don't. We're uncomfortable, and a lot of times we're ignorant and having to solve the problems with the wrong tools. So I think having a clear mission mandate, a clear focus, and having the properly trained and experienced folks to solve that from both the public and the private sector, to bring that together, is critical. I wouldn't really make a recommendation as to how to get there. Obviously, Congress has a say, the president has a say, but I do think that the ability to bring together all of the forces that are already working towards this, that are trying to do this, and they're running with parachutes on their back and running into headwinds because of the lack of real clear mandate, bring that together and put that to work. I think that you would see huge impact very quickly, and I think it's in everyone's interest for that to happen.
The Department of Defense commands unrivaled market power through its investment in the DIB. Leveraging that market power is a growing part of our response to foreign adversaries. But along with that is the very real threat of adversarial capital and undue influence in the U.S. industrial base, and the need to further leverage public and private sector investment strategies to secure our most critical defense supply chains. Thanks to David Rader and Wes Spurlock for being part of today's episode. I'm Elaine Dezenski, and this is Coercive Capital on the Illicit Edge Network.